Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. According to a new report published in Nature Communications, previous estimates of how many people would be impacted by rising sea levels made a gross underestimation. This report, while using more sophisticated models, predicts that the track on which sea levels are rising could end up destroying 300 million homes by 2050. That means more cities are at the risk of drowning and more people facing the impending doom of displacement. Now, on today's show, we try to understand right from the basics, why are our oceans expanding, how this is currently impacting the environment, and how it will do so in the future, and what can be done to make communities more resilient towards the change. Joining us for this discussion is Sven Harmeling, expert and global policy lead on climate change and resilience at CARE International. He joins us from Bonn. Also joining us today is Svein Tveitdal, climate expert and former UN director, joining us from Oslo. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Harmeling, now let me begin with you. Give us a sense of a general overview of how our oceans are changing.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of factors coming in here. I mean, on the one hand, as a consequence of global warming, we're seeing melting of glaciers, melting of ice caps, both in the northern hemisphere, like in the Arctic, but increasingly also in the Antarctic, and something which climate scientists until a couple of years ago have felt, okay, the Antarctic is safe for another century, we don't have to worry about it. Processes accelerate, and these add basically water to the oceans. And then the second important factor is the thermal expansion, because the ocean is becoming warmer and water expands. When it becomes warmer, the sea levels are rising as well. So there are different factors, but they can all be attributed to the global warming, to the global climate change as a consequence of fossil fuel and other emissions.
Right. Now, Mr. Tveitdal, as Mr. Harmeling gives a sense of how the oceans are changing, explain to the viewers what this means when these oceans change in this way, when the oceans expand, when they absorb more heat. How will this impact the environment?
Yeah, let me first go quite basic and say that until now, from the Industrial Revolution, we have had a sea level rise around 20 centimeters. And up to 5-10 years ago, the International Panel for Climate Change had a best estimate that we would have another 60 centimeter throughout this century. Now, there is a lot of new alarming reports, the one you referred to included, that is suggesting that we might see a much higher sea level rise, more than 1 meter, maybe up to 2 meters in this century. And the main reason for this is, point one, the global policy to stop climate change is not successful. And it looks like both Greenland and Antarctica is melting much faster than we believed only 10 years ago.
Right. Now, when we're talking all of this, and you've explained from the basics as to why this is happening, what impact is this having on communities right now in the present age and the present moment?
That will be extremely challenging. The first societies I would mention is the small island development states. There are around 24 of them within the UN. If you take, for instance, the Maldives, Male, the capital there, the highest point on that island is 1.5 meter. And with these new estimates, the whole country, together with other small island development state, is completely threatened for extinction. And when you they understand it very well. So when we look into the negotiations in the UN, actually one of those small states have one vote, the same as the United States. And they are fighting as much as they can, but it is not good enough. So they are extremely threatened. And you have coastlines like Bangladesh. You have also rich countries like Florida. So this will have this will be a tremendous challenge, and research now say that we actually, when it comes to Greenland and the ice over the Arctic, we have crossed and we have passed the point of no return. So on your question, what can we do with this? Probably we can not do anything else than trying to, in a way, adapt to a sea level that will be much higher. And in addition to the sea level rise, you will have spring flow and extreme weather.
Right.
So,
Mr. Tveitdal, now you mentioned a very important point here that since what is happening, we have not had global policy aligned with the impending disaster. What can we do? It is adapt to the rising sea levels. And this is what I'm going to ask Mr. Harmeling. Do you agree with that, that since we haven't done anything before, what needs to be urgently done now is to adapt to the situation?
I mean, definitely adaptation is an absolute necessity. There will be significantly more impact, including sea level rise, over the next 20, 30 years, whatever we do on emission reductions now. But all the scenarios are also very clear that beyond that point, in the longer term future, in the next 30, 40, 50, and even more 100 years, what we do today in terms of emission reduction determines the sea level rise of the future. So both is absolutely needed, investing into adaptation measures, also finding ways to deal with people who have to leave their homes because adaptation is not possible, and that will be the reality for many people, but also really still pushing for cutting global emissions. So the more we can limit climate change, the less we have to face these problems.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, now in this show, what I do is make this information as accessible to the viewers, as simple for the viewers as possible. So give us a sense of what happens when global emissions rise to the oceans. What is the link there?
I mean, when global emissions rise, more heat will be trapped in the global climate system, and that basically leads to an increase in temperature. And because of that, oceans are warming, and the oceans absorb a lot of those additional warming. Like a buffer a bit. And also, like we said earlier, glaciers are melting, and this is very, very slow to reverse. And so I think that's why we said we have to confront some of these impacts and adapt to them. I think in terms of adaptation, there are, of course, some possibilities in some regions. I mean, for example, we've also been involved in programs with mangrove planting, which can be a kind of natural source to stabilize some of the coasts and keep out some of the, let's say, additional surges, etc. All of this has to happen at much larger scale, but we also know it will likely have its limits. This may depend from country to country. Right. I think generally every country, every policymaker has to look at these studies because it's just something that will affect your country, it will affect every coastal city, and it's really urgent to deal with that.
Right. Picking up from that point that Mr. Harmeling mentioned here, that almost every coastal region will be impacted by this. You mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why this is happening is the failure of a global policy to be able to tackle this issue heads on. Now, tell us, why is this a global problem, and what is it that countries are missing in trying to understand that this is a global phenomena and not just specific to certain regions?
No, it varies a little bit. When we talk about, let's say, 1 meter sea level rise, it's not exactly the same everywhere, but it is generally a problem. But if we go back to the international negotiations and the Paris Agreement, the countries agreed that we have to limit the warming to 2 centigrades. Even if we manage to do that, we will probably not. The ice over Greenland and the ice over the Arctic will continue to melt. We will have an ice-free Arctic in the summer 20 to 40 years from now. So some of these things which we have known for at least 30 years is now impossible to stop, actually. But so we have to adapt to it. But of course, it is even more important than before that we try to limit the further warming as much as we can. And but what happens just now is very, very worrying, because, for instance, last week there came a report from the Meteorological Institute in Sweden with new, more detailed models that now said that best case is 2.4 degrees and worst case this century is more than 6 degrees, which would be a recipe on a complete global climate catastrophe. So it gets more and more serious, but we have to work harder and harder to get to stop the emissions, and of course also now put a lot of effort into adaptation to, for instance, a sea level rise that we cannot stop.
Right. So when we're talking about all of adaptation for you, and I'm going to put this question to Mr. Harmeling as well. For you, Mr. Tveitdal, what is the most essential thing that coastal regions, and especially those in developing nations, they need to do?
One issue is, according to the Paris Agreement, there should be a global green fund on $100 billion that should go to both adaptation and mitigation. Unfortunately, the global society has not managed to put this money there, and there is so many things we could do better that we don't manage.
Right.
So
I take your point.
We will see now.
Right, yeah. And I asked Mr. Harmeling the same thing now. Mr. Harmeling, for Mr. Tveitdal, what he has urgently highlighted, what needs to be done is that the Green Fund, the money that should be allocated towards it for capacity building in developing nations, that should be done. For you, what do you think is needed, the thing that is needed right now?
Well, I think the Green Climate Fund is an important point, but of course, developing countries also cannot wait for that money to come. I mean, every city planner who is in charge today needs to look at those scenarios and identify what does it mean for us. What are some of the areas in the cities which we will be able to protect? What does it cost? What are the areas which we can protect? And I think a particular attention also needs to go to those people and communities which are most marginalized and poorest and most vulnerable, because we know from all those studies that they are in the most critical situation. And so I think, unfortunately, every country has to act, developing countries as well, while at the same time we need to push for more financial support to those countries.
Right. Now, I mentioned here that it's the marginalized and poorer communities which suffer the most at the hands of climate change generally, and especially when we're talking about this. Give us a sense of how agricultural communities, those whose livelihoods depend on water resources, their entire systems will be impacted by what's happening right now and what we're going to expect to see in the future with these sea level rises.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also predicts that there will be more storm surges. And for example, if you're a coastal community and have agricultural area on the coast and you have faced more storm surges, then your areas might be flooded and might be kind of poisoned by salt. And once you have the salt in the soil, it's really difficult to get it out again. And so it will harm your harvest. There's some level of adaptation you can manage through salt-resistant droughts, but we're also seeing that these only work for a couple of years because climate change is moving on. So I think it's really looking at where do we need to diversify our agricultural strategies in those communities, where can we build stocks and better protection against sea level rise. Unfortunately, certain people or certain communities will also have to face the situation that they need to move further inland.
Right. And in all of this, Mr. Harmeling, just a last question to you before I do let you, is that there does seem to be a gap in the science that is coming out and the policies that are being carried out on the ground. What do you think is the biggest hindrance here in governments actually taking action that is needed, protecting vulnerable communities and communities themselves being able to take action?
Yeah, I think unfortunately there's still too much of an underestimation of the real challenge and the real problems we're seeing from climate change and how it accelerates. And I think that really needs to get into the minds of decision makers, and the decisions we take today will shape the future generations' possibilities to basically survive on this planet. But I think there's also an underestimate of the potential of really shifting course in terms of moving from fossil fuels to renewable energies. There's so many cheaper solutions now, and we really need to act. And I think basically every new coal power plant that is being built is an attack on future generations because of its contribution to climate change. And I think local communities are rising up in many countries. That's very positive. And we really also need to, for example, change the subsidies. Many countries still put billions of dollars into fossil fuels. You can invest the money much more wisely and still develop your community sustainably and in a well manner.
Right. On that point, thank you much, Mr. Svein Harmeling, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Tveitdal, now, the point that Mr. Harmeling ended on is a very essential point. He talked about there being an underestimation of us shifting our systems to a more sustainable one. Now, in all of this, do you also agree that it's not as difficult as it seems? Because many communities do come up with this is how our livelihoods are designed. This is how the system is designed. Uprooting it won't only take time, but it's almost near to impossible.
No, I think it's actually more difficult than people believe. We know the solutions. Sven is absolutely correct that we have all the tools. We have through the green shift, renewable energy and so forth. But the problem is that the market is not pushing this shift fast enough, and it must be so much faster than it goes now. And that means that the politicians need to take away subsidies, put taxes on emissions, and invest in renewable energy in a much tougher and more ambitious scale than they do today, and they actually don't do it. To take last year, despite of all this, we had an increase in the global emissions on more than 2%. Mainly, it's actually both rich and poor countries, because it's India that increased mostly, then China, the US and Russia. And when we now meet in Santiago in a month on the next climate summit, these countries will not, in a way, put on the table, and they stand for 50% of the global emissions. They will not put on the table suggestions that will solve the problem. So we are a bit stuck. And personally, I think that the most, in a way, important thing that has happened the last year is the young people that understand that they will have a very difficult life in the end of this century.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Svein Tveitdal, for joining us and talking to us. Now we're joined by Charlie Baker, who's an architect who focuses on sustainable architecture. He joins us from Manchester. Thank you so much, Mr. Baker, for joining us, and welcome to this show. Now, we've been talking a lot about how more preemptive measures need to be taken to a rise in sea levels. In all of this, give us a sense of how our cities are being designed right now, and whether do you think they're compatible with the doom that we're seeing being predicted in all these reports?
It's very difficult to start from a position of the cities themselves, because in many cases you have a picture of Venice there. They've been around for thousands of years in many cases, and so they are where they are. And the problem with redesigning our cities is the massive resource footprint that would create if we started trying to move them. However, sea level rise is coming. The inertia in the sea, which is the biggest absorber of heat on the planet, means that we're probably looking at a locked-in amount of sea level rise of probably 2 or 3 meters already over the coming millennia, simply from the temperature rise that we've already had being transferred through the ocean. So that question about how we design our cities depends on what timescale. Are we looking at the next 10, 15, 20 years and trying to deal with severe storm events? Or are we looking at the species in the long term and what civilization means and which cities we leave for future generations and hopefully on a better planet? And if it's the former, then there are various measures. Miami is going to spend $500 million raising pavements. I believe Holland is going to spend half the entire GDP of Bangladesh on raising all of its dams, which obviously is not an available option for low-lying cities in the developing world or the poorer parts of the planet. And so I think what we're doing is not enough, but the problem is not the design of the cities. The problem is the mitigation of the massive emissions that we need to drop. If we don't do that, the design of our cities will not save us.
Right. So when we're talking about mitigation of these emissions, and you're saying that's where the problem begins and that's what we need to tackle urgently. Do you think the way our cities are being planned, the way our urban centers are being planned, the way our system is being run in a manner in which it is able to mitigate these emissions?
In some cases, there are some valiant efforts, but I think on the whole, no. So, for example, in this country, there is a considerable push to reduce the energy required to run our buildings, but with very little comparable work to reduce the emissions in building them in the first place. So I specialize in refitting buildings to reduce their emissions to zero. However, just to keep up with the UK's new build housing programme, we would need to be doing 2.5 million houses a year. And manifestly, that's neither practical nor indeed do we have enough houses to do. We've only got 25 million homes to treat, so we are not going to be able to buffer all of that carbon footprint. So we need to be reusing much more of our built environment rather than knocking it down and rebuilding it. We need, therefore, to think about which bits we can protect and which bits we have to abandon. And I think, therefore, the grand plans may well not be what we need. We may need to go a bit smaller. Maybe we should be looking at those low-lying cities that have got coral and mangrove near them and make sure that those are retained, protected, refurbished wherever possible. We should be making sure that we make the best use of the natural means of flood protection. So I know that the Dutch are strengthening their beaches by loading things onto those. Maybe that's another way forward. And again, it's not in the city. I think there are obviously things you can do in cities, like when we have floods in the UK, and I suspect it's the same over much of the planet, the sewage infrastructure has a tendency to overflow.
Right. What do you think needs to be done in the overall macro system for it to become more sustainable and for it to become more compatible with what we're seeing right now?
I think the first thing we have to start with, it all comes down to that climate change mitigation. If we can keep temperature rise to the 1.5 degrees, which is looking distant, but maybe we'll still do it, but definitely let's not go over the 2 degrees, then we might be looking at 0.5 meter of sea level rise by the end of the century. And that's still going to produce considerable displacement. But imagine that displacement multiplied 4 times if we don't get a grip on our emissions. So I think that is the first place, that the amount of displacement will be vast if we don't get it together. And I think my side of the planet is living in a dream world where it thinks that pattern of exploitation and resource extraction and indeed consumption that it's carried out for the last 2 or 3 centuries cannot continue. And so I think the other macro side of this is that we need to recognize that a lot of that displacement has been caused by our failure in the West and in the wealthier parts of the world to rein in our consumption when we were told it was going to cause a problem some 30 years ago. And now there is a price to be paid. And currently the ultimate price is going to be paid by the poorer people of the low-lying parts of the developing world. And they're going to want to move. And they're going to be cross if they can't move. And I think we should be doing an awful lot more in the West. There are the populations of northern Spain and Italy are actually shrinking. And so obviously there are some considerably well-versed and practiced opinions about not wanting to let the immigrants in, but it's about time we recognize that we are one species, that our civilization depends on us being civilized, right. and we should actually be helping these people out, because It was like we caused so much of this.
Right. For now, thank you so much, Mr. Baker, for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss what is happening in Chile. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, since the 18th of October, millions have come out on the streets to protest in Chile after the government announced a 3% price hike on the capital city's metro system. But while this hike is seen to be the trigger for this massive protest, on today's show, we take a closer look at what is unfolding in this Latin American nation. Joining us for this discussion today, Camila Vergara, a Chilean who is currently a postdoctoral research scholar at Columbia University Law School. She joins us from New York. Thank you so much, Camila, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, Camila, as you see what is happening in Chile, do you feel like it is surprising? The narrative that the world hears is that Chile is a success story. Its economy has progressed miles ahead of any other Latin American nation, and then this happens. Was it surprising for you?
Thank you. No, for me, it really was not surprising because I've been looking at the constitutional framework in Chile and how riches are distributed in Chile. So I could say that generally we have seen Chile as a very stable and highly growing country. So therefore, compared to the rest of Latin America, it seems like a miracle in terms of economic growth. However, this economic growth has been based on a very unequal base, which has been based on a neoliberal model that was established by the dictator Pinochet in 1973, and we came to democracy in 1990, and then the several governments from the left and from the right have been reproducing and deepening this neoliberal model that has yielded this protest today. Because basically what happens is that Chile has a 23,000 per capita GDP. However, the average Chilean only makes $400 a week. And the majority of basic services are completely privatized. So therefore, a 3% increase in the metro tariffs doesn't seem much, but for middle-income families who are in debt and who actually pay 45% of their income in paying off their debts, this is a very high increase.
Right. Now, of course, whatever is happening in Chile, and you give us an overview of the inequality that continues to persist in the community. Now, with the trigger of this 3% hike on the metro system, that was seen to be something very minor to trigger something in which millions and millions of people come out on the streets. But what do you think was happening right before this happened? What were the sentiments on ground, the feelings of the people, and especially young people and students?
Yes, there are two movements that are very important to take into account. So in 2011, there was the very big protest that started with the students in the streets, because the same as the United States, the Chilean education system is mostly private, and the tuitions are not stable. So therefore, tuitions for college have been going up, and people finance this through debt. So in 2011, students came to the streets to demand free college because they were graduating with huge amounts of debt and were unable to find jobs. So that was the kind of the beginning of the youth movement. That youth movement yielded a new set of political parties from kind of like the new left that is today in Congress, but because of the electoral system and the rules of the game, this new political force hasn't been able to yield too much of a change. Then we had a huge also a protest a couple of years ago that started against the pension systems. So the pension system was privatized in the 80s, and today people save for themselves, and therefore if you have a very low income job, you are going to save very little money for your retirement. So people are going into retirement with $100 a month, which is very, very low. So people have been going into the streets not only to demand more money for pensions and more money for education, but to actually change the system in which education and pensions and healthcare also have been built. So what happened here is that the students started a movement to evade the fare, so to jump the turnstiles and just not pay for the subway. And it was very, very effective the first day. The problem was that the government instructed the police to repress this peaceful civil disobedience. And the social media, people started posting videos of police repression in social media. And then there was a fury of the majority of population seeing how police was treating students by engaging only in civil disobedience.
Right. So on that point, Camila, I'd like to also introduce another guest who's joined us, Dr. James C. Franklin, Professor and Chair of Politics and Government at Ohio Wesleyan University, joining us from Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Franklin. Now, as Camila pointed out here, that the reaction of the government in Chile was one in which they tried to repress the movement, the student movement. It was a peaceful protest, but then, of course, it turned dangerous and violent. Now, this is something we're witnessing all across the world when we're seeing global protests emerge and erupt. Do you think that this tactic just emboldens the protesters even more when authoritarian governments try to suppress them?
Yes, repression often backfires, and the more that they use violence against protesters, all that does is it creates more sympathy with the protesters, more media attention, and they find that there are more people willing to join their cause or aid them in some way. It often takes an extreme amount of repression to stop a powerful protest movement.
Right. So now in all of this, you're talking about how this will just give more momentum to the protesters. Give us a sense of how you're witnessing the global climate of young people coming out on the streets. What do you think would make a protest successful and their demands to be taken seriously?
Yeah, we're seeing diffusion of protest around the world. And as far as what leads to a successful protest, well, smart tactics help. There's a lot of evidence that remaining nonviolent helps, but there are ways to find tactics that are nonviolent and yet are somewhat out of the ordinary. Things like, I found in my own research, occupations, hunger strikes, other types of labor strikes. They provide a little more pressure, yet they are nonviolent, and so they win more sympathy for the protesters, especially if there's any repression used against them.
Right. Camila, I'm going to go back to you and specifically discuss the case we're seeing unfold in Chile. Now, as you mentioned yourself, that it was because of the neoliberal policies that were adopted in the past, ever since independence, that the system has come out as being one of the most unequal systems. In fact, according to a UN report from 2017, 1% of Chile's population earns 33% of the nation's wealth. That's a great figure there. Do you think that this protest could bring about meaningful change?
Well, I think that the protest could bring meaningful change. First of all, the government responded by caving for giving the demands that some of the people in the movement wanted. However, even if after the president gave these demands, fulfilled them, at least theoretically, they kept going out. And actually on Sunday, we saw a massive march of people going to Congress to demand the end of repression and also the structural change of the system. However, very different from other parts of our world where prime ministers resigned. In Chile, we have a very presidentialist system, which means that the president has almost all the power and can govern by decree almost. So therefore, the president is very unlikely to resign, even if people this is what they're demanding, because there's no outside pressure. So they are completely insulated. And this is why the changing the constitution is so important, because the constitution is the one insulating government officials from public pressure.
Right. Dr. Franklin, on that point of can there be change in Chile, I do want to ask you a question that is more generalized. The whole concept of protesting, coming out on the streets, does it have inherent value even if the outcome isn't of bringing about great reform within the country, or there isn't great change?
Yes, it does help to build a more unified civil society. You can look back, actually, in Chile is a great example of this. There were protests, massive protests in the 1980s against the Pinochet authoritarian regime, and they were not able to oust him from office, but through the protest movement, they were able to build a more unified opposition force, which was able to contest a plebiscite they had in 1988 and defeat him in this plebiscite. And it created a more unified basis for democratic governance moving forward. And so protest movements, they usually don't reach all of their goals, but the more powerful, persistent ones are able to reach at least some concessions and create this this organization that can be used going forward.
Right. Now, on that point as well, when we're seeing history of Chile and what is happening in the present moment with people coming out on the streets, and we also talk about the inequality and the divisions within society, do you think that this protest will also bring about some more unification amongst the people? Do we see a larger demographic coming out and fighting for their rights?
Yes, correct. So at the beginning, as I said, they started with students, and then it was a very kind of low class, low social class movement. But then with the police brutality and all the videos are starting unearthing, the middle classes also joined banging their pots. And it's very interesting because banging pots was a strategy used by the right-wing middle class protesting the Allende government in the 1970s. But today it has been appropriated by the movement, and everybody has been banging their pots at night in order to manifest their discontent with the repression and with the lack of substantial change. Yes.
Right. Dr. Franklin, just the last question to you before we wrap up the show here. Now, as we talked about earlier, we're seeing protests erupt all across the world in different places. Do you think that this global wave of protests inspires protests in other locations? And do you feel like that also might be the case in what we're seeing in Chile happen right now?
Yes, I believe so. I believe there is a strong diffusion effect in many cases. We saw this in the Arab Spring in 2011. Protests is not only about grievances. People don't always protest when there is recession or unemployment. There's also a factor of opportunity and of a belief of they can be successful in protests. And so when they've seen protests that are able to gain international attention and able to achieve concessions from government, that can really have an effect to inspire protests in other countries. And I think the Hong Kong protests have inspired protesters around the world. And more immediately in Ecuador, there were massive protests against a removal of fuel subsidies, and protesters were able to force the government there to back off and withdraw that policy change.
Right. On that point, we've come to the end of our show. Thank you so much, Dr. James Franklin, for joining us, and Camila Vergara for joining us from New York. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.